She publicly humiliated me online and thought it was the end of my story forever. I didn't react or respond. Months later, my success became the ending she never expected and couldn't ignore anymore. He's nobody. Literally nobody. The kind of guy you date when your standards are at rock bottom. That was the caption. Right there, underneath a photo of me. Taken without my knowledge, sitting alone at a coffee shop, laptop open, looking exhausted. She had tagged the location. She had tagged the date. She had tagged mutual friends. And she had written that sentence like she was doing the world a favor. I sat there reading it on my phone, in that same coffee shop, at that same table, and I didn't move for a very long time. There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't scream. It just sits. It settles into your chest quietly, like smoke filling a room, and before you realize what's happened, you can't breathe. That was the moment. I didn't know it yet, but that post, that caption, those 11 words, were about to change the entire direction of my life. Not in the way she intended. Here's what I stood to lose if I reacted the wrong way that day. My job was already fragile. I was 3 months into a junior role at a mid-sized tech firm, still in the probation window, still proving myself every single day to people who had not yet decided what they thought of me. I had colleagues who followed her. I had a manager who occasionally scrolled social media during his lunch breaks at his desk. One wrong move, one public argument, one emotional outburst, one screenshot war that spread through the same circles, and my name would be attached to drama. Not hers. Mine. Because that's how it works, and I had already learned that lesson once before in a different situation. The person who fights back always looks worse than the person who started it. The person who reacts publicly becomes the story. I had no savings worth mentioning. I had a lease I could barely cover without cutting corners somewhere else every month. I had a 5-year plan I had only just started building from scratch after we broke up 3 months earlier. And I had a reputation, still forming, still soft at the edges, still new in this industry, that could be permanently shaped by the next 48 hours depending on the choice I made in the next 60 seconds. The post was already spreading when I read it. Comments were appearing. People I hadn't heard from in months were suddenly active in that thread. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. The choice I made in that coffee shop, in those first 60 seconds after reading her words, was either going to bury me or become the foundation of something I couldn't yet imagine standing on. I chose silence, not out of fear, out of a very cold, very deliberate understanding that some battles are won not by entering the arena, but by refusing to acknowledge it exists. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. I was 26. We had dated for 2 years. It ended 3 months before she posted that. She had a following, not massive, but substantial enough. Around 9,000 people across platforms. Enough for the post to reach everyone who mattered in our shared social world. Enough for it to land in the specific way it was designed to land. Let me tell you what the 2 years actually looked like, because you need to understand it to understand why that post stung the way it did. And more importantly, why it also didn't quite finish the job she intended it to do. We met at a company event, not my company, hers. A friend had dragged me along to some product launch thing. Free food, free drinks. The kind of evening you show up to without expectations and leave surprised by how much you actually enjoyed yourself. She was standing near the window, talking loudly about something, and she had this energy that seemed to fill the room without any apparent effort. Loud, magnetic, a little chaotic. I was drawn to it immediately. I should have paid more attention to the word chaotic. We started talking. She asked what I did. I told her honestly. I was working a contract role at the time, still figuring out the next move, building something on the side that hadn't taken off yet, but that I genuinely believed in. She tilted her head. Not unkindly. Not obviously. Just assessingly. Like she was filing that specific piece of information away in a particular folder in the back of her mind. I noticed it. I chose to tell myself I was reading into nothing. First dates make you generous with your interpretations. We went on 3 more before it became official. By the 4th month, we were spending almost every weekend together. She was funny, genuinely funny, the kind where you're laughing before you've even finished hearing the punchline. She was sharp in conversations. She had opinions about everything, and she wasn't afraid to say them, which I respected because I had spent years around people who said nothing and meant even less. But somewhere around month 7, something shifted. Small things, at first. Easy to dismiss individually. She'd mentioned something about a friend's boyfriend, his recent promotion, his salary increase, his new flat in a better part of the city, and then she'd look at me. Not accusatory, not overtly mean, just a look. A small, quiet comparison hanging in the air between us like a question neither of us was naming. I told myself I was being oversensitive. Month 10, she started introducing me differently at social gatherings. Not by name first, by context. This is, well, he's kind of in between things right now. It's a process, you know how it is. I smiled every single time. I said nothing every single time. I kept building the side project in the evenings. I kept going to work in the mornings. I kept telling myself that words were just words and actions were what ultimately mattered. I was wrong about that, by the way. Words are seeds. You say them enough times about a person, in the right rooms, to the right people, in the right tone, and they grow into something that person has to spend years digging out of the soil. Not just the words other people hear. The words that start to form in your own internal narrative, too. By month 18, I had started feeling it somewhere I couldn't easily explain. The way she sighed when I talked about my work. Not a theatrical sigh, a small one. The particular kind that says I've heard this before, and I'm not entirely convinced it leads anywhere. The way she'd ask, is that really going to go somewhere? Not as a genuine question that wanted a genuine answer, but as a sentence she attached to the end of a long exhale. And then there was the dinner. 18 months in, 8 people around a table, her friends, nice restaurant, good wine. Somewhere in the conversation, my work came up. She smiled. She looked at the table. She said, "He's very ambitious, bless him." And everyone laughed, including me. I picked up my fork. I kept my face easy and pleasant. And I quietly added one more item to the list of things I was eventually going to prove. Not for her. At least, that's what I told myself at the time. The truth is more complicated. And it took longer to fully untangle than I expected. The breakup came at month 24. I initiated it. That surprised her. I could see the recalibration happening in real time across her face, like she had a script ready and I had skipped ahead to a scene she hadn't had a chance to prepare for. She said, "Okay," more times than I could count. She said, "I just think you're scared of where this could go." I didn't argue. I didn't explain myself in the full detail I might have if I'd believed it would change anything. I collected the things I had gradually left at her place. A phone charger, 3 books, a pair of headphones I'd assumed were lost, a gray hoodie I had been vaguely looking for across 4 months, and I left. I thought that was the end. 3 months of silence passed. 3 months of rebuilding a daily routine around the shape of her absence. 3 months of working mornings and evenings on the thing I had been building in the margins of the relationship. And then the post. I read it 4 times. The first time, automatic. Shock. The second time, careful, confirming I hadn't misread it. The third time, analytical, reading the comments, noting the names. The fourth time was something different. Something very quiet and very deliberate. Then I put my phone face down on the table. Then I ordered another coffee. I sat there for almost an hour, not composing a response in my head, not rehearsing the perfect thing to say, not running through all the people I could contact who might help shift the narrative. Just sitting, watching the room around me. A woman at the corner table marking papers with a red pen, working efficiently through a stack. 2 men in suits having a quiet argument about something they clearly disagreed about fundamentally. A teenage kid 3 tables away with headphones on who had been there as long as I had and hadn't moved. Nobody in that room knew what was happening on their phones right now. Nobody knew that my name was currently circulating as a punchline on someone's social media. And at some point during that hour, something very quiet happened inside me. Not the hot anger that comes from being insulted directly to your face. Not the wet, heavy grief that comes from betrayal. Something colder and cleaner than either of those. A decision, made without drama, without an audience, without a single word spoken to another person. I was going to build something she couldn't ignore. And I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that. Revenge is loud. Revenge posts responses. Revenge composes screenshots and sends them to mutual friends at exactly the right moment. Revenge is pain that has dressed itself up in strategy clothes and convinced itself it's above the thing it's doing. I wasn't going to do any of that. I was going to do this because I already wanted it. Because I had been building toward it in the gaps between her sighs, in the quiet that followed her dinner table punchline, in the dark of my flat on the nights when her voice was still somewhere in my head telling me that ambition was a quality to be pitted when it hadn't yet found a visible result. The post didn't create the goal. It just removed the last thing standing between me and complete commitment to it. She thought she was ending my story. She was actually cutting the last rope. I didn't respond to the post. Not that day. Not the next day. Not that week. Not ever. A mutual friend texted me within an hour of it going up. Did you see what she posted? I replied, yeah. Are you okay? Yes. Are you going to say something? No. 3 dots appeared. Stayed a long time. Then, that's probably smart. I put my phone in my bag, opened my laptop, and worked for the next 4 hours without stopping. That evening I went home, made food I didn't really taste, sat at my desk, and wrote a document. Not for anyone else, just for myself. That listed everything I was trying to build. Every goal, every timeline, every milestone I had been treating as aspirational that I was now going to treat as non-negotiable. I printed it. I put it on my desk. I went to bed. Over the following week, I watched the post collect comments from a careful distance. Not obsessively, just enough to understand the landscape accurately. Some people were neutral, the kind of engagement that isn't really engagement, just scrolling noise. Some were enthusiastic, adding their own layers to the story she had started, embellishing with things they thought they knew. And a few people who had always seemed genuinely friendly to my face left small approving emojis. That last part was useful data, not painful. Or maybe it was, and I had simply decided to convert that particular energy into something productive rather than let it settle. I unfollowed everyone who had engaged warmly with the post. Not dramatically blocked, not announced, just quietly reorganized my digital world so I could see it with more accuracy and move through it with more clarity. Let me tell you what I was actually building, because this is the part of the story that matters more than any other part. For the last 8 months of the relationship, the months I was supposedly going nowhere, I had been working nights and weekends on a content strategy consultancy. What that means in plain terms, I help small businesses and founders understand how to present themselves, what to say about what they do, how to say it in a way that actually reaches the right people, how to identify who those people are in the first place. It sounds simple when compressed to a few lines. It is not simple. It requires you to understand people at a level significantly below the surface. Their fears about how they're perceived, their aspirations about what they want to be known for, the gap between how they currently see themselves and how the outside world currently sees them. And it requires you to close that gap with language that feels genuinely true rather than manufactured. I had been doing it informally for almost 2 years before deciding to build it into something real. A friend's bakery. She made extraordinary food but talked about it like she was apologizing for taking up space in a market that already had enough bakeries. A cousin's tutoring service. Genuine talent for reaching students who had been written off by the system, but his entire online presence looked like it had been designed to be invisible. A stranger I met at a networking event who ran a small architecture firm, and when I asked him what made him different from the 40 other architects in the same city, stared at me for a full 10 seconds before saying he wasn't sure he had ever thought about it quite that way. He had the answer. He just hadn't located it yet. That was the work. Finding the answer that was already there, buried under years of defaulting to whatever language everyone else in the industry was using. I had 3 paying clients when the post went up. None of them were paying particularly well, but they were paying, and the work was genuinely good. After the post, I made a decision that felt extreme when I first said it out loud. No more side project. No more treating this as the thing I was building alongside the job I actually had. This was the thing. The only thing I was genuinely willing to bet everything on. I went to my manager and renegotiated my hours to part-time. She looked at me for a moment with the specific expression that managers use when they're trying to assess whether you're making a career mistake or a life choice and don't want to say the wrong thing either way. I told her I was building something and I needed the time. She said she respected it even if she didn't fully understand it. I took the pay cut. My stomach dropped the first time I saw the smaller paycheck. But I had done the maths 3 times before I made the decision, and the maths held. My lease came up for renewal. I didn't renew it. I moved into a smaller flat, less natural light, a kitchen that was technically just a section of the living room, a shower that took exactly 2 minutes to warm up every single morning without fail. But the rent was £240 less per month. That's almost £3,000 a year. £3,000 a year that could flow into the business instead of into a flat I had originally chosen at a point in my life when I was trying to look like everything was fine even when it wasn't. I stopped spending money on anything that existed primarily to manage appearances. When I actually looked at my bank statements clearly, without the background haze of being in a relationship where social visibility carried weight, without the ambient anxiety of keeping pace with someone else's definition of visible success, I found a surprising amount of money that had been going toward looking like I was fine rather than actually being fine. I redirected all of it. I got uncomfortable, deliberately, with full awareness of what I was choosing and why. Because I had spent 2 years being comfortable with the wrong things. And I knew, with the particular clarity that arrives after someone has publicly called you nobody and you've spent an hour deciding what to do about it, that the version of myself I was trying to reach lived on the other side of a sustained period of uncomfortable, unglamorous work. Not suffering, not martyrdom dressed up as dedication. Just the specific discomfort that comes from choosing the harder, narrower path when an easier road is still technically available. Month 1 after the post, a fourth client. A small clothing brand run by a woman who had spent 3 years perfecting the product and 3 years talking about it in exactly the same language as every other clothing brand in her market. Generic, forgettable, safe in a way that was actively costing her visibility. We worked together for 6 weeks. I helped her find the voice that was already hers, the actual story behind why she had started the brand, who she was making it for, what she genuinely believed about the clothing industry that made her perspective different from everyone else's. By the end of those 6 weeks, her social engagement had tripled, not from a trick, not from a tactic, from sounding like herself instead of sounding like the market. She was grateful in a way that felt real and specific rather than polite. She referred me to someone else. That someone referred me to 2 more. Month 3, 7 clients. I was working long hours. The kind of hours that would have looked, from the outside, identical to the exhaustion in that coffee shop photo. Same dark circles, same cold coffee, same slightly too warm jacket. But the internal experience was completely different. There's a meaningful distinction between exhaustion that empties you and exhaustion that fills something in. The first kind comes from spending your energy on things that don't matter to you. The second kind comes from spending it entirely on something you have decided is worth everything you have. I was living in the second kind, and I was learning, in real time, to feel the difference from the inside. I started documenting the work, not to build a platform, not to attract followers or position myself as an expert, just to keep track, to understand what was working and what wasn't, to notice the patterns that were starting to repeat across different businesses, different founders, different industries. A few people found what I was writing. Not many, but a few, and they kept reading. I didn't push it. I just kept writing, kept working, and let the 2 things run in parallel. Month 4. Something changed in the quality of the conversations with clients. I noticed it gradually. Founders were starting to share things in our sessions that they hadn't mentioned in the first meeting. The real fears underneath the strategic questions. The way a business problem was also, at some level, a question about how the person at the center of the business saw themselves. The gap between who they had told the world they were and who they actually were and what they actually wanted the work to mean. I started to realize that what I was doing wasn't purely content strategy. Or it was that, but it was also something more fundamental underneath it. I was helping people close the gap between how they currently presented themselves and who they actually were. And the businesses that got that right, that built their voice from the inside out rather than copying the surface language of their market, those businesses grew differently than the ones that didn't. More durably, with customers who stayed because they genuinely connected with what the brand stood for, rather than customers who arrived because of a promotion and disappeared when the next one came along. I started writing about this specifically, about the cost of sounding like everyone else in a market that already has more than enough of everyone else. About what happens when a founder finally starts speaking in their actual voice and the market responds to something it hadn't been able to find before. I wrote about it plainly, without jargon, without trying to make the idea sound more complex than it actually was. And something happened that I hadn't planned for. People shared it. Not just the people I already had relationships with. Strangers. People in industries I hadn't worked in, cities I hadn't visited, businesses I hadn't thought about. The writing was beginning to travel further than I had intended it to go. Month 5. A piece I had written, specifically about a mindset shift I had been watching in businesses that were actively growing versus businesses that were quietly going nowhere, got picked up by a newsletter with a significant professional readership. Not viral in any mainstream sense, but within the specific world of founders and consultants and people who thought seriously about business positioning, it landed with some force. Suddenly, my inbox had inquiries from people I had never met. No existing relationship. No mutual contact who had made an introduction. They had simply found the writing, read it, and reached out. 11 of them in a 3-day window. I remember sitting at my desk, in my smaller flat, with the 2-minute shower in the kitchen that was technically part of the living room, staring at those 11 emails. There was a specific moment there. Hard to describe accurately. I thought about a specific dinner 2 years ago. The table, the people around it. A voice, measured and amused. He's very ambitious, bless him. And the laughter that followed. I replied to all 11 emails that same day. Month 6. I left the part-time day job. Fully. The consultancy was now generating enough to cover rent, basic expenses, and a buffer that was getting slightly larger every month. Not rich. Not anywhere near rich. But self-sustaining. That word matters in ways that are difficult to explain to someone who hasn't lived the difference. There's a version of financial stability that is built on depending on a single source of income that is controlled entirely by someone else. You can live in that version for years and feel secure. Until one phone call, and you don't. And then there's a version built from something distributed, multiple relationships, multiple streams, each one tied directly to the value you're actually creating. A version where no single decision someone else makes can take everything from you in a morning. I had crossed from the first version into the second. Nobody marks that crossing. There's no ceremony. No card arrives. No moment where someone pauses to acknowledge it. You just wake up one morning and realize that the specific fear that had been living in your chest for years, the fear of being nobody, of building nothing, of being the punchline at someone else's table while everyone around you laughs, has been replaced by something quieter and much more solid. Not arrogance. Not the loud confidence that needs external validation to feel real. Just a low, clear, unshakable certainty. The direction is right. The foundation is real. The work is working. Month 7. I need to tell you about this month carefully, because this is where the story turns in a way I genuinely did not engineer or plan for. One of my newer clients, a founder running a small tech-adjacent startup, asked me to come to an industry event he was sponsoring. The kind of evening where the food is better than you expect, the conversations range from brilliant to completely pointless, and who you end up standing next to is mostly luck. I almost canceled. It had been a long week. I had a proposal due at the end of it. The small flat, the 2-minute shower, the kitchen that is really a corner, all of it was starting to feel, on that particular evening, like exactly the wrong setting to leave. But I went. The room was not large, but it was the right kind of density. The kind of room where a conversation that lasts 12 minutes can open a door that stays open for 3 years. I had 2 conversations that evening that changed the shape of what came next. The first was with a venture-backed startup founder, early stage, strong product, communicating it terribly to anyone outside her direct industry. She was describing her company in language that made complete sense to people who already understood the technical landscape and 0 sense to anyone else. A classic positioning gap. I had solved a version of it 4 times in the previous 6 months. We talked for about 20 minutes. At the end, she asked if I did this kind of work professionally. I told her I did. She asked for a card. I handed her one. She looked at it for a moment longer than necessary, and then looked at me with an expression I had started to recognize. A recalibration happening somewhere behind the eyes, a quiet revision of the assumption she had arrived with. I walked away from that conversation feeling something I had learned to trust. Not hope, forward momentum, the kind you can feel physically. The second conversation arrived unexpectedly. I was standing near the drinks table, waiting, when someone said my name behind me. I turned around. A woman I recognized vaguely. A friend of a friend, someone I had met once or twice when my life and hers had overlapped through a shared social circle 2 years earlier. She smiled in a way that seemed genuine. "I follow your writing," she said. "Actually, the piece about the positioning gap. I sent it to my whole team." She worked at a consultancy. I found this out over the next 4 minutes of conversation. Not a small one. A substantial firm with real clients and a structure that included bringing in external specialists on specific projects rather than keeping everything in-house. She asked whether I had considered partnering with established firms on certain kinds of work. I told her honestly that I was open to it if the fit was right. She asked me to send an overview of the work. I sent it 2 days later. Not overselling. Not underselling. Just an accurate, clear account of what I did, who I had worked with, and what had actually changed as a result. 3 weeks later, she replied asking to schedule a meeting. 3 weeks after that, I was sitting in their conference room. Glass table, chairs that cost more than my rent. 6 weeks after that meeting, I had a contract on my screen. A formal one, with a scope of work and a retainer structure and a fee that I read once and then read again to confirm I had understood the number correctly. I sat in my flat that evening. I ordered food without calculating the cost first. I sat at my desk and didn't do anything for a while. And I thought about a photo of me alone at a coffee shop. 11 words. 9,000 people. The 60 seconds in that same coffee shop when I put my phone face down and made a decision no one would ever see me make. Here's what she didn't know when she wrote those words. She didn't know that I was at that coffee shop every morning because the Wi-Fi in my flat was unreliable and I had client calls scheduled 3 mornings a week that required a stable connection. She didn't know that the laptop in the photo had 3 client documents open simultaneously, a proposal in progress, and a revenue spreadsheet I was updating at the end of every week. She didn't know that the exhaustion on my face was not the exhaustion of someone running out of road. It was the exhaustion of someone running at a pace that was slightly ahead of what their body could comfortably sustain. She had taken a photo of a building mid-construction and presented it to 9,000 people as evidence of ruins. She had photographed the visible surface of something she fundamentally did not understand and then captioned it with the confidence of someone who was entirely certain they had the full picture. That's the thing about trying to publicly humiliate someone. It requires accurate information. You have to actually understand what you're looking at. Otherwise, you're not describing reality. You're projecting a story you've already written onto the surface of a person you never took the time to genuinely know. The story she had written about me, the one she had been assembling quietly across 2 years of small comments, quiet comparisons, dinner table tones, and sighs. That story was never really about me. It was about her need for a particular kind of visible, already arrived success beside her. And because I was still mid-becoming rather than already there, I didn't fit the image she needed. That's not a character indictment. That's just an honest account of how 2 people can occupy the same space for 2 years and somehow never actually see each other accurately. But let me go further back, because this is the part one held off telling you. The part that reframes everything that came before it. 6 months into the relationship, she showed me a spreadsheet. I'm not exaggerating, an actual spreadsheet. She had built it herself, and it had columns for things like projected income trajectory, asset accumulation timeline, and lifestyle compatibility index. She didn't show it to me as a joke. She showed it to me as a framework. A way, she said, of making sure the people in her life were aligned with where she was going. I remember sitting with my coffee going cold, looking at the spreadsheet on her laptop screen, trying to figure out how to respond to something I had never encountered before. I said, "Where do I fit in this?" She said, "That's why I'm showing you. I want to be transparent." I told myself it was actually kind of admirable. The honesty, the directness, the refusal to pretend that practical considerations didn't matter. A lot of people think about these things and say nothing. She was at least saying it out loud. But what I didn't let myself fully absorb in that moment was what the spreadsheet actually revealed. It revealed that she had decided in advance what her life was supposed to look like. And she was running every person she brought into it through a filter to determine whether they fit the predetermined shape. It wasn't about who I was. It was about whether I matched the template. And the version of me she had met. Contract work, side project not yet launched, no visible markers of the kind of success the spreadsheet was built to measure, didn't match. She decided to give it time. She gave it 2 years. And when, by her assessment, the metrics hadn't moved far enough in the right direction, she started to let the small comments accumulate. The sighs, the reframings, the dinner table moment. Not cruelty, exactly. More like someone who had been waiting for a data point that hadn't arrived and was gradually, without fully realizing it, beginning to resent the wait. When I broke up with her, I didn't tell her about the spreadsheet. I didn't tell her that I had thought about it many times over the 2 years, had turned it over in my head, had measured myself against it more often than I wanted to admit. I just left. But the spreadsheet had done something useful, in the end. It had taught me exactly what kind of life I didn't want to build. A life evaluated from the outside in. A life shaped around being legible to someone else's metrics. A life where the goal was to look like success before you had found the thing that was actually worth building. The consultancy, the real thing, the work that ended up matching, was built entirely from the inside out. From what I actually believed. From the problems I genuinely cared about solving. From the kind of value that couldn't be entered into a spreadsheet column because it lived in the specific difference it made to a specific person's specific situation. And no template built in advance could have predicted it. Because that's the thing about becoming. It doesn't follow the template. It follows the person. Month 8. The startup founder I had spoken to at the event came on as a client. We worked together for 10 weeks. Her product had a full messaging overhaul. Not a surface rebranding, a structural rebuild of the entire voice from the foundation of what the company actually believed and who it was genuinely built for. 3 months after the new messaging launched, she got a profile piece in a publication that her entire industry reads. The journalist had found her because of the clarity in how the product was now being described. In the interview, when asked about the company's communication evolution, she mentioned the consultancy by name. I hadn't asked her to. She just did, because she was accurate and she wanted to be accurate. That mention produced 4 inquiries in the week following publication. I was no longer chasing the next piece of work. Work was arriving. There's a transition point in building something. I don't know exactly where it falls. It's different for everyone, where the momentum shifts fundamentally, where you stop being the person pushing the thing uphill and the slope starts to gradually, almost imperceptibly, flatten beneath you, where what you're building develops its own gravity. I reached that point somewhere in month 8. I know because I remember the specific experience of waking up one morning with my first thought not being about survival, not calculating whether the finances would hold, not running through the list of potential clients who hadn't yet responded, trying to read meaning into their silence. Just a clear morning. A desk full of work I was genuinely excited about. A version of myself I recognized as the one I had always been building toward, even in the periods when I couldn't see him clearly. Month 9. I should tell you how she found out. Not because the finding out is the central point, but because it happened the way these things tend to happen in an age of connected everything. Not through a planned confrontation, not through a mutual friend deliberately carrying news between 2 camps, not through any action I took. It happened because the internet is significantly smaller than it appears. The publication that had mentioned my consultancy also ran a brief profile piece. 20 questions, surface level, the kind of professional feature that circulates within specific industry communities and gets shared among people who work in that world. Someone shared it in a group chat that still, apparently, contained people from our old shared social circle. Within 24 hours, an acquaintance from that circle sent me a message. Congrats on the write-up. Wild how things work out. I thanked him. The next morning, a different notification arrived. Her name. In my messages. I want to be precise about the internal experience of seeing that notification because precision matters here. Not triumphant. Not the hot, clean satisfaction of a long overdue vindication arriving exactly on cue. Not wounded either. Not the old, familiar pull of unresolved feeling. More like neutral. The specific neutrality that comes not from not caring, but from having moved genuinely far enough away from something that it no longer has the reach to affect you. The way you feel when you hear a song you used to love deeply and you realize you have simply grown past the place where it had purchase. It's not that the feeling is entirely gone. It's that you've outgrown the place where it lived. I open the message. 3 paragraphs. Carefully composed in the specific way messages are when someone has rewritten them several times before pressing send. The first paragraph said she had seen the write-up and wanted to reach out to say she was proud of what I had built. The second paragraph was a version of an apology, not a direct one, more of a looking back. That post probably wasn't my finest moment framing, surrounded by enough qualifying language to keep it technically ambiguous. The third paragraph asked whether I'd be open to getting coffee and catching up. I read it twice. Carefully the second time. I thought about 2 years of small moments. The sighs, the dinners, the introductions, the laughter. I thought about a photo of me at a coffee shop and 11 words underneath it. And then I put my phone down. Not dramatically, not as a statement, not as the final act in some story arc I had been building toward. I just set it down and moved to the next thing on my desk. Because that's what I had learned in the 9 months between that post and that message. At some point, the people who tried to define your ceiling stop feeling like either a threat or an audience. They stop being the villain or the motivation or the final boss at the end of the level. They become part of the landscape you already passed through. A section of road you drove on a long time ago that doesn't require looking back at. Let me tell you where things actually stand. The consultancy has 12 active clients. 2 of those are ongoing retainer relationships with organizations significantly larger than anything I was working with in month 1. 3 are businesses I would not have had access to 18 months ago, not because the capability wasn't there, but because the track record that opened certain doors had not yet been built. The writing has found an audience. Not a massive one, but a real one. People who work in fields I find genuinely interesting, who think about problems I care about, who occasionally send messages that make it clear the work is landing somewhere useful rather than just going out into a void. I moved again, not back to the size of place I left. Somewhere better. A flat I chose because I actively wanted to live in it. Because the light comes in at the right angle at the right time of the morning. Because the neighborhood feels like mine rather than like a compromise I was making while waiting for something better to become available. That distinction, choosing something because you want it versus choosing it because it's currently accessible and you can technically afford it, is one of the quietest and most significant markers of how much has changed in a year. And here is what I want to say about the people who witnessed all of this. The ones who liked her post. The ones who left the laughing emojis. The ones who, when I saw them at shared events in the months that followed, looked at me with the particular expression people wear when they've already decided who you are and are not planning to revise it. Not one of them reached out when the write-up appeared. Not one of them sent a message. And I want to be honest about what that tells you. Not as a condemnation, but as genuinely useful information about the nature of that kind of social behavior. When you are publicly diminished, the people who pile on are rarely doing it because they genuinely believe you are nothing. They are doing it because it's free. It costs them nothing. It requires no courage, no independent assessment, no willingness to stand apart from whoever is loudest in the moment. They are just agreeing, because agreeing costs nothing, and the alternative, which is defending someone or at minimum staying neutral, requires taking a position. And when you succeed, those same people go quiet. Not because they're ashamed, because acknowledging your success would require them to revise a public position they took, and revision is uncomfortable. It's easier to let the original post scroll back into the feed until it's unreachable without effort. To let the narrative dissolve quietly on its own terms. To simply move on as if neither thing happened. I understand that now. And understanding it made me genuinely grateful for the silence that followed the write-up. Because it told me with complete clarity who those people were. And it removed all remaining ambiguity about whether I needed to invest any more energy into those relationships. The people who sent genuine messages when things changed, not the performative ones, not the ones designed to position themselves as having believed in me all along, but the ones who had stayed quiet during the post, stayed quiet in the months after, and then reached out simply because they were glad for me. Those were the right people, the ones still in my life. The rest cleared themselves out through their own choices. That was a gift she gave me without meaning to. A clean and efficient sorting of who was actually in my corner and who had just been standing near me when it felt comfortable. I want to tell you the thing I actually think about. Not every day, but sometimes, in the quiet at the end of a long evening, when the work is done and the flat is still, and I have a moment with no obligation sitting immediately in front of me. I think about that photo. I think about the version of me in it. Tired, slightly hunched over a laptop, in a coffee shop I was using because the Wi-Fi at home was unreliable, wearing a jacket that was slightly too warm for how the room was heated that particular morning. I think about what he couldn't see from inside that moment. He couldn't see that every call he was making in those mornings was planting something that hadn't broken the surface yet. That every hour of uncertain revenue and quiet doubt at 2 in the morning, and choosing the smaller flat, and the part-time hours, and the discomfort of the long in-between was the cost of entry to a place that simply does not let you in any other way. There is no backdoor. There is no shortcut that doesn't come at a different and usually steeper cost somewhere further down the road. The uncomfortable path is the path. And the exhaustion on his face in that photo was not the mark of someone whose story was over. It was the mark of someone whose story was still being written in places no one else could see yet. She photographed that moment to illustrate an ending. She framed it, captioned it, published it to 9,000 people as evidence of a conclusion she had already decided on. But she had the context entirely wrong. She had always had the context wrong, if I'm being completely honest about it. She had spent 2 years looking at the visible surface of what I was building, the incomplete parts, the not yet arrived at parts, the current state rather than the direction it was heading, and concluding from what she could observe at the surface what the final outcome would necessarily be. That's not a uniquely cruel mistake. That's a very human one. We look at the surface of a thing, and we conclude we understand the whole of it. We look at someone in the middle of becoming, and we describe them as if the middle were the destination rather than the road toward it. We see the tired face in the coffee shop, and we write the caption. We don't ask about the calls. We don't ask about the documents open on the screen. We don't ask what direction the exhaustion is actually pointing in. We just see the visible layer, and we tell ourselves we've seen enough. But becoming is always invisible from the outside until it suddenly isn't. The surface is never the whole story. And the people who make the mistake of writing the ending before the story has reached it, they just end up looking at their screens one morning, 9 months later, reading about the chapter they tried to delete. Not with the hot satisfaction of some planned comeback landing, just with the quiet, private knowledge that the direction was always right, that the work was always working, that the 60 seconds in the coffee shop, the ones where I put the phone face down and ordered another coffee and made a decision no one would ever see me make, those 60 seconds were the whole story. Everything after them was just the consequence of choosing correctly in a moment when choosing wrongly would have been significantly easier. She wanted 9,000 people to close the book on me. Some of them did. They saw the caption and the photo, and they closed the book and scrolled to the next thing. And that's fine. Books don't need every reader. They need the right ones. The clients who believed in the work before it had reached the scale it has now. The collaborators who came to the table because the writing reached them. The strangers who sent messages saying something I had written at 1 in the morning had changed how they were thinking about their own work. Those were the right readers. And the story they were reading didn't have an ending yet when she tried to write one for it. It still doesn't. I am still building, still writing, still working mornings in places where the Wi-Fi is better than at home. Still, occasionally, looking tired in coffee shops. Still mid-becoming. Still very much in the middle of the road. But moving. Clearly, visibly, undeniably moving. And there was still a lot more story left. There was always a lot more story left.